in our early formation, we are enormously suggestible. That is to say, we're impressionable, that what we hear and know permeates us and also enters into our own desire and our own tendencies, our own movements, our own ways of seeing the world, quite without our knowing and without any regard for our will.
Another major concept that is central to your thinking is performativity, which you distinguish from performance. Could you say a few words about performativity and this psychic mimesis that you are discussing?
Well, I can. I mean, maybe let's go back to the problem of mourning and melancholia. At least in the early essay, Mourning and Melancholia, Freud distinguishes between mourning as accepting the verdict of reality that someone or something has been lost. And melancholia denies that reality or seeks to circumvent the acknowledgement of that reality. And yet the melancholic, at least Freud tells us, will reproduce the voice of the lost person in their own mind as a judge or as a superego. And in that way, in wrestling with this judge or superego, the melancholic is able to keep alive that relationship to the other. But it is, to some degree, internalized. In fact, that internalization will eventually change the structure of the psyche, according to Freud. And we can, I think, wonder about what role mimetic reproduction has in psychic life under conditions of melancholia. But also in mourning, Freud tells us, very typically someone in mourning will take on the garments of the one who is lost, if it's another person who is lost. If it's a nation that is lost, they'll take on the flag or the costume of an earlier time, trying to incorporate or make as part of one's own bodily appearance this other who is lost. So a kind of incorporation, sometimes of gesture or of voice, but also of clothing, a reproduction that is meant to overcome the loss or to keep the one who is lost, but now as part of oneself. So, Freud thought that melancholia was pathological at the time that he wrote the first essay. But by the time he wrote The Ego and the Id, he thought that, in fact, it's inevitable that we incorporate parts of people, places, even ideals that we have lost as part of who we are. So they become incorporated aspects of the ego itself. And that incorporation changes who we are. In other words, when you've lost something really important and you survive that loss, you survive as somebody different. You're not the same as you were before that loss, because that loss has changed the structure of who you are. And I think he thought that was just. Like, yes, that is the case. We don't just take libido away from one person and put it into the next. We carry that trace. And the way we carry it is more or less mimetic. Incorporation always does involve some dimension of mimesis. I think internalization, like the superego of melancholia, is not always the same as incorporation. So lovingly taking on the sweater of the person you've lost is a little different from carrying around a judge in your head that is sentencing you to death or condemning your actions, which is very often what happens with a melancholic, or a melancholic starts to complain. There are many grievances. There are many things that are wrong with the world. No restaurant is right. No person on the street is right. There's a massive complaint that's not yet been heard. But of course, the reality of the loss has not yet been reckoned with. So that form of internalization is different from the positive sense of incorporation, that Freud found in mourning. So we could possibly then identify two different mimetic processes.
And it's interesting to me, this moment, and we are spending some time on it, because at least the way I see it, it seems to allow for your work that has to do with opening up your thinking about subjectivity and gender to issues of power, grief, and a certain ethical concern for otherness.
Yes.
That is always already internal to the self. Or
Yes.
You write in the Precarious Life that we can be possessed and dispossessed by others, undone by grief.
Yes.
Is that a continuation of that problematic that we are discussing now?
I think so. I mean, I believe that, there are horrible ways of being undone by others when we're robbed of our dignity, or we're exploited, or our trust is abused, or somebody deprives us of a fundamental infrastructural condition of our lives, like shelter or healthcare or food. But there are other ways of being undone, which means that our sense of self-sufficiency or our understanding of what possibilities the world holds for us, when that gets undone, something new, novel can happen, or we find that we are given over to others in ways that we did not fully understand. And when they leave or depart or die, we are undone because who we are is bound up with our relationship with them. And that can be fairly catastrophic, but it also tells us something about who we are as living creatures, that we don't find ourselves we don't find our lives inside ourselves. We find our lives in relation with others. And so I am, in my very life, most intimately also, at the same time, in relation with others, and without those relations, who is this I? It's very unclear.
Yeah, that's also one of my reasons in this fascination with this concept of mimesis, and it opens up this relationality that I find at play also in the way you write. I mean, you've been often critiqued for the difficulty of your early writing, but you also write in a certain way that addresses the reader with questions, for instance.
Yes.
Is that an attempt to perform at the level of rhetorical style a certain relationality that you're already kind of discussing at the level of content?
I have no idea. Maybe. I mean, that's for the reader to decide. It's not like some deliberate plan.
But you do ask a lot of questions.
I've always asked a lot of questions. That's just my way.
Yeah.
I can't account for that.
But it does have that effect on me as a reader.
Yeah.
So that if I'm asked a question, I'm bound to, interpolate it.
Yes, well, I suppose it's an invitation.
It's an invitation.
It's an invitation.
Yeah.
I do want to invite the reader
Yeah.
into a space of shared thought.
Yeah. Maybe we can move forward to the relationship between ethics and violence and non-violence. This question of grief that you took via Freud, mourning and melancholia, opens up the question of the lives we can grieve and those that we cannot. There are certain lives, you stressed a lot in the Precarious Life after 9/11, right, that we're not allowed to mourn or grieve a certain amount of people, and the strategies for identification or disidentification to take place, especially in the media. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of your work?
Well, it's always strange, if not disturbing, to talk about lives being grievable or not grievable. Even in English, it's not really a word. I mean, you can make it, but not standard. Grievability is worse. That will get me more critics. But I think on the one hand, when we talk about a grievable life, we're talking about a life that is considered valuable in a specific social or political order, and is worthy of grief, or we are mindful of the precariousness of that life, and we take all the necessary steps to make sure that life has what it needs in order to live. The infrastructures of life are secured for that person. And people who are not considered grievable, and we're talking about living people, not those who are already lost. Living people who are not considered grievable are those for whom the infrastructures of life are lacking, and social and political policy is organized in such a way that it doesn't matter. They're either neglected and may die by virtue of negligence, or they are targeted, as they are, say, in war. And if they die, that's not considered a loss, and it's not considered something that one would regret or mourn or find to be unjust. So I think that it's an important distinction during times of war, but it's also a term that we could use about the planet. Since if we're talking about infrastructures of life, we're also talking about living processes, and the destruction of the living processes on the planet, the willful or negligent destruction of life forms, of species, presuppose that these forms of life are not grievable, that it doesn't matter if they're lost. But I see grievability as an attribute that characterizes living processes and living beings, that they're already sorted prior to death into those who would be grieved and those who would be not. And once you're someone who would not be grieved, then you can be dispensed with. And we know that there are different ways of death dealing, some of them slow, some of them quick. But I'm afraid that social inequality can't really be thought through fully or substantively without understanding the unequal grievability of living creatures. So for me, the interdependency of life, which some would say is an ecological concept or a Buddhist concept, I'm not sure where I am in that way, but the interdependency of life is really crucial for thinking about equality, because we're not just, as humans, we're not just individuals who should be equal to one another. We can't even understand individuality without understanding the context of social relationality that makes individuality possible. And once we start thinking about social relationality, where we then talk about interdependency, ways in which that is exploited, ways in which that is acknowledged or even affirmed. But we also then have to move beyond the human to talk about the interdependency of life. And that will help us, I believe, in fighting climate destruction and very possibly in developing a politics against war. So both my commitments to nonviolence and my commitment to developing a way of thinking and imagining that would oppose climate destruction and expose it for what it is are linked in this way.
Since you mentioned war and we're talking now in the present, you have had trouble identifying in terms of gender, but you always identified as Jew, while being at the same time critical, outspoken about Israel.
Yes.
This opens up an entire debate, but I was wondering if you wanted to say something about grievability in relationship to the present, what is happening right now to the Palestinian people.
I think one of the definitions of genocide that has been accepted by legal scholars is the attack on the infrastructures of life that supported a particular people. And I think that is what we see in Gaza when hospitals and shelters this morning, schools this morning, residences are bombed when civilians are targeted. So the answer to that is not, in my mind, a violent resistance. I understand many people are in favor of violent resistance. I actually am not. I understand why some people are in favor, but I don't agree with them. I think we have to imagine the world in which all the infrastructures of life were supported, where everyone on that land could live together under a new constitutional democracy, where everyone has equal citizenship and no one is discriminated against on the basis of race or religion or ancestry or something like that. So I've always actually had a certain impossible dream, one that relies on an idea of cohabitation. I think that's not really what's happening right now. No. I don't see very many people on either side who would join up. But maybe precisely at those moments where people are locked down in their war perspectives, you're either on one side or the other. And those two sides are represented by Netanyahu and Hamas. If you're not on either side like that, but you do want Palestinians to live in freedom, full freedom, and you want everyone in that region to live without the fear of violence and on conditions of equality, there's no place for you to stand, because the one side accuses you of being on the other side, and the other side accuses you of being on that side. So I've been accused by both sides of being on the other side, and now I've given up. I'm just coming out as an idealist for a future world, an impossible world. And even though the way things are going is quite in an opposite direction, horrific direction, I would like to see a transnational anti-war mobilization that would also bring Palestinians and Israelis into its organization. I think it's time.